The elevator doors opened to his penthouse, and Theodore Whitmore heard something that made his blood run cold. Singing. A woman's voice he didn't recognize, coming from his kitchen, where his 7-year-old twins were supposed to be alone. But what he found when he rounded that corner, flour everywhere, his children laughing, and a black housekeeper teaching them secrets from his dead wife's cookbook, would either be the best thing that ever happened to his family, or the mistake that would tear them apart forever. Hello, my amazing family and friends. I'm so glad you're here with me again today. If you're ready to dive into another powerful story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me the country or city you're watching from. And guess what? Tomorrow, I've got another story lined up that will leave you just as captivated, so don't miss it. Now, let's get started. Theodore set down his briefcase and listened. No cartoons blaring from the living room. No sound of his 7-year-old twins arguing over video games. Instead, he heard something that made him freeze completely. Singing. A woman's voice, rich and melodic, drifted from the direction of the kitchen. Not the Spanish he expected from Maria, their usual nanny who'd taken the week off. This voice carried the deep, soulful tones of old spirituals, the kind his grandmother hummed while baking cornbread in her Alabama kitchen decades ago. Theodore followed the sound through his marble-floored foyer, past the living room where his late wife Catherine's piano still sat untouched, toward the heart of his home. As he rounded the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. The woman standing at his kitchen island had her back to him, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing simple jeans and a cardigan that had seen better days. She was swaying slightly as she stirred something in a large mixing bowl, and scattered around her on the granite countertop were ingredients he definitely hadn't purchased. Flour dusted her hands, and the scent of vanilla and cinnamon filled the air. But it wasn't the baking that shocked him. It was his children. Emma sat perched on a bar stool, her usually perfect blonde curls loose and slightly messy, flour smudged across her cheek like war paint. She was giggling as she tried to crack an egg into a smaller bowl, missing spectacularly and getting shell fragments everywhere. Ethan stood on a step stool beside the woman, his small hands covered in what looked like cookie dough, his face more animated than Theodore had seen it in months. "Now, baby, you gotta fold it gentle-like," the woman was saying, her voice carrying a warmth Theodore hadn't heard in his house since Catherine died. "Pretend that dough is something precious you don't want to break. Like Mama's pictures?" Emma asked softly. The woman paused her stirring, and Theodore saw her shoulders soften. "Exactly like your mama's pictures, sweet girl. Some things in this world are so special, we gotta handle them with extra love." Theodore felt something crack open in his chest. When was the last time he'd heard his children mention their mother without tears? When was the last time he'd seen them this happy? "Miss Keisha," Ethan said, licking dough from his finger. "Will you teach us the song again? The one about the river?" "Miss Keisha." Theodore frowned. He'd hired a cleaning service, not a nanny. Who was this woman, and why were his children calling her by name like she was family? "Course I will, baby boy," Keisha replied, her voice like honey over gravel. "But first, let's get these cookies in the oven. Your daddy might want some when he gets home from his big important business trip." "He won't want any," Emma said matter-of-factly, her small voice cutting through Theodore like a blade. "Daddy doesn't like cookies. He doesn't like anything sweet anymore." Theodore's hand tightened on the doorframe. "Out of the mouths of babes." "Well," Keisha said carefully, "maybe your daddy just forgot how good sweet things can taste. Sometimes grown-ups get so busy thinking about work and bills and serious stuff, they forget about the simple things that make life beautiful. But that doesn't mean they can't remember." She began humming again, that same spiritual that had drawn him home. Emma and Ethan joined in, their small voices blending with hers in a harmony that filled every corner of his sterile, expensive kitchen with something Theodore couldn't name but desperately wanted to bottle and keep forever. For a moment, he just watched this stranger treat his children with a tenderness he'd forgotten existed. Watched his twins smile and laugh and be children in a way they hadn't been since the funeral. Watched flour fly and dough stick to fingers and joy spread across faces like sunshine after rain. Then Keisha turned around to grab something from the counter, and her eyes met his directly. Time stopped. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe early 30s, with warm brown eyes that went wide with shock when she saw him standing there. Her hands flew to her hair, smoothing down imaginary flyaways, and Theodore watched as every ounce of ease drained from her body. "Mr. Whitmore," she breathed, and he heard fear creep into that beautiful voice. You're not supposed to be home until Sunday." The children spun around, and Theodore forced his face into what he hoped was a smile rather than the confusion and something else he couldn't quite identify that was churning in his gut. "Daddy!" Emma shrieked, jumping down from her stool and running toward him with floury hands. "You're home early. Miss Keisha is teaching us how to make grandma cookies." Grandma cookies. Catherine's mother's recipe, the one he'd watched his mother-in-law make every Christmas until she passed 5 years ago. The recipe Catherine had tried to recreate, but never quite mastered. The recipe he'd hidden away with all the other reminders of before, when his house was a home and his children still believed their father hung the moon. "I can see that," Theodore said carefully, accepting Emma's hug while his eyes remained locked on Keisha's. "And who exactly is Miss Keisha?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended, and he watched Keisha flinch slightly. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, straightening her shoulders in a gesture he recognized as someone preparing for battle. "I'm Keisha Williams," she said, her voice steady despite the apprehension in her eyes. "I work for Spotless Solutions. I've been cleaning your home for the past 2 months while you've been traveling." 2 months. She'd been in his house, around his children, for 2 months, and this was the first he was seeing her. The cleaning service always worked around his schedule, coming when he was at the office, gone before he returned. He'd preferred it that way. Minimal interaction, minimal disruption to his carefully controlled routine. But now, looking at his children's faces, flower-dusted and bright with happiness, he wondered what else he'd been avoiding. The cleaning service didn't mention. He started, then stopped. What exactly was he objecting to? That she was baking with his kids? That she was making them smile? That she was filling his house with warmth and laughter for the first time in 2 years? "I apologize, Mr. Whitmore," Keisha said quickly, already moving to clean up the baking mess. "Maria called out sick this week, and the kids were here alone when I arrived Monday morning. I should have contacted you, but Emma said you were in important meetings that couldn't be interrupted, and I just—" She paused, glancing at the twins who were watching this adult conversation with the sharp attention children reserved for moments that might change their world. "I couldn't leave them by themselves." Theodore felt something cold settle in his stomach. They were alone? "Just for the mornings," Keisha said quickly. "Emma said Maria usually doesn't come until after lunch, and the school doesn't start until next week, so they've been staying home. I couldn't clean around them and pretend they weren't there. So I started bringing some activities, and then Emma mentioned she missed her grandmother's cookies, and—" She trailed off, probably reading something in his face that made her realize she might have overstepped every professional boundary in his carefully ordered life. But all Theodore could think about was his 7-year-old children, alone in this big house morning after morning, while he sat in conference rooms halfway around the world making deals that suddenly seemed far less important than the fact that a stranger had shown his kids more genuine care in 2 months than he had in 2 years. What kind of father was he? And what kind of man was he about to become? What do you think Theodore is feeling in this moment? Have you ever discovered something about your own life that completely changed how you saw yourself? Share your thoughts below. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the timer on the oven beeping insistently. Keisha moved to check the cookies, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were defusing a bomb rather than simply baking. Theodore washed her hands, steady despite what he imagined must be racing thoughts, and felt something shift in the air around them. "Daddy, are you mad?" Ethan's small voice cut through the tension. "Miss Keisha didn't do anything wrong. She was just being nice to us." Theodore looked down at his son, really looked at him for the first time in months. When had Ethan gotten so tall? When had that gap-toothed smile become so hesitant around him? When had his own child started looking at him like he was someone to be managed rather than loved? "I'm not mad, buddy," Theodore said, crouching down to Ethan's eye level. "I'm just surprised. Tell me about these cookies." Emma bounced over, her earlier enthusiasm returning. "They're Grandma Catherine's recipe. Miss Keisha found it in Mama's cookbook, the one with all the papers stuck in it. She said Mama must have been trying real hard to get it right." Theodore's breath caught. Catherine's cookbook. He'd packed it away with everything else, unable to bear the sight of her handwriting in the margins, her failed attempts at recreating her mother's magic documented in frustrated scribbles. How had this woman found it? Why had she bothered to look? The children mentioned they missed their grandmother's baking, Keisha said quietly, sliding the cookie sheets out of the oven. The kitchen filled with the scent of childhood, of holiday mornings, and maternal love. I found the cookbook while cleaning the pantry last week. There were so many notes, so many tries, it seemed important. She set the cookies on cooling racks, and Theodore watched his children's faces light up with something he hadn't seen since before Catherine got sick. Wonder. Anticipation. The simple joy of children who believed good things were coming. Can we try one now? Emma asked, practically vibrating with excitement. They need to cool first, baby girl, Keisha said, then glanced at Theodore uncertainly. That is, if your father thinks it's okay. And there it was. The moment that would define everything that came next. Theodore could feel it hanging in the air between them. This choice that was about so much more than cookies. His children were looking at him with hope in their eyes. This stranger was looking at him with cautious respect, and somewhere in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 2 years was beginning to crack. Why don't you tell me exactly what's been happening here? Theodore said, pulling out one of the bar stools and sitting down. From the beginning. Keisha exchanged a look with the children, some silent communication passing between them that Theodore both envied and feared. When had his kids developed relationships he knew nothing about? When had they started having lives that didn't include him? Monday morning, I came to clean like usual, Keisha began, wiping down the counter as she spoke. But when I let myself in, Emma and Ethan were having breakfast alone. Emma said Maria had called out sick, but nobody had arranged for alternative care. Theodore felt heat rise in his neck. He'd been so focused on the Tokyo deal, so buried in contracts and negotiations, that he'd barely registered Maria's text about being ill. He'd assumed she'd arrange coverage like she always did. He'd assumed his children would be fine because they'd always been fine, because he'd built a life where everything ran smoothly without his direct involvement. Emma made cereal for both of them. Keisha continued, her voice carefully neutral. She's 7 years old, Mr. Whitmore, and she was taking care of her brother like a little mother. The words hit him like a physical blow. Emma, his baby girl, forced into a role no child should have to fill because he'd been too busy, too absent, too lost in his own grief to notice his children were drowning right alongside him. I couldn't just clean around them and pretend everything was normal, Keisha said. So I asked if they wanted to help. Just small things at first. Emma liked organizing the books, and Ethan wanted to help dust the furniture. But then, she paused, glancing at the children again. Then what? Theodore prompted, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Then Emma started crying, Keisha said softly. Right there in the living room, next to your wife's piano. She said she missed her mama, missed the way the house used to smell like home, missed having someone who cared if she brushed her teeth, or ate her vegetables, or had bad dreams. Theodore's hands clenched into fists on the marble countertop. He wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain that he'd been trying to provide for them, trying to keep the company running, trying to hold together the pieces of their life that Catherine's death had shattered. But looking at his children's faces, he realized they didn't need explanations. They needed their father. So I made lunch, Keisha continued. And Emma asked if I knew any songs, because her mama used to sing while she cooked. So I sang. And Ethan asked if I could teach them how to make something special, because he wanted to surprise you when you got home. And Emma found that cookbook, and she gestured helplessly at the cooling cookies, at the flour-dusted kitchen, at the evidence of care and attention and love that had filled his sterile house in his absence. You've been babysitting them all week, Theodore said, the reality finally sinking in. I've been caring for them, Keisha corrected, and there was something in her voice that made Theodore look at her more closely. They're good kids, Mr. Whitmore. Smart and funny and so hungry for attention, for someone to see them. They've been taking care of each other for so long. They've forgotten what it feels like to be taken care of. The criticism was gentle but unmistakable, and Theodore felt it land in his chest like a stone. This woman, this stranger he was paying to clean his toilets, had seen what he'd been too blind to notice. His children weren't just missing their mother. They were missing their father too. Miss Keisha reads to us, Ethan said suddenly, apparently deciding the grown-up conversation had gone on long enough. She does voices for all the characters. And she braids Emma's hair the way Mama used to. And she listens, Emma added. Like, really listens. When I tell her about my dreams, or about school, or about missing Mama, she doesn't just say that's nice, sweetie, and keep doing other stuff. She stops and looks at me and asks questions. Theodore felt something break apart inside his chest, something that had been holding his ribs together for 2 years. When was the last time he'd really listened to his children? When was the last time he'd stopped working long enough to hear what they were actually saying? The cookies should be cool enough now, Keisha said quietly, clearly trying to redirect the conversation away from his parenting failures. She plated 3 cookies on a small dish and set it in front of Theodore. They looked perfect, golden brown and slightly cracked on top, exactly the way Catherine's mother used to make them. The way Catherine had tried and failed to recreate dozens of times, leaving frustrated notes in the margins of recipes like archaeological evidence of her love. Theodore picked up one cookie and took a bite. The taste hit him like a freight train. Butter and vanilla, cinnamon and brown sugar. But underneath it all, something indefinable that tasted like Christmas morning and birthday parties, and the kind of unconditional love that only came from someone who chose to care for you not because they had to, but because they wanted to. He closed his eyes and for a moment, he could almost hear Catherine's laugh, could almost feel her presence in the kitchen where she'd spent so many hours trying to perfect this exact recipe. But instead of the sharp pain he usually felt when memories of his wife surfaced, there was something else. Warmth. Gratitude. The recognition that love could continue even after loss, could grow in unexpected places, could come from the most unlikely sources. When he opened his eyes, Keisha was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe. Hope. Fear. His children were watching too, their faces anxious, as if his reaction to these cookies might determine the fate of their newfound happiness. They're perfect, Theodore said, his voice rough with emotions he'd forgotten he possessed. They taste exactly like Catherine's mother used to make. Emma clapped her hands together, bouncing on her toes. Miss Keisha said Mama was probably just missing one special ingredient, and that's why hers never tasted quite right. What ingredient? Theodore asked, though he suspected he already knew. Keisha met his eyes directly, and he saw something in her gaze that made his pulse quicken. Love without worry, she said simply. Your wife was trying so hard to make them perfect for you and the children that she forgot to make them with joy. The recipe was right. She just needed to trust it. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond baking. Theodore understood what she was really saying, what she'd figured out about his family in 2 months while he'd been blind to it for 2 years. They'd all been trying so hard to be perfect, to maintain control, to avoid the messiness of grief and healing that they'd forgotten how to actually live. But this woman, this housekeeper whose last name he'd only learned 10 minutes ago, had walked into their broken family and somehow found a way to put love back on the table. And Theodore Whitmore, billionaire CEO, master of the universe, realized he was about to fall completely apart. Or maybe, for the first time in 2 years, he was about to fall completely together. Theodore pushed back from the counter abruptly, the stool scraping against marble with a harsh sound that made everyone flinch. The cookie crumbled in his hand, sweet perfection turning to dust between his suddenly trembling fingers. I need to make some phone calls, he said, his voice tight and controlled in the way that had closed million-dollar deals and intimidated boardrooms full of executives. Emma, Ethan, go wash up. We need to discuss proper arrangements for next week. He saw the light die in his children's eyes, watched their faces close off like shutters slamming shut against a storm. Emma's lip trembled for just a moment before she pressed it into a thin line, and Ethan's shoulders hunched forward in that protective way that meant he was preparing for disappointment. Yes, sir, Emma whispered, taking her brother's hand and leading him toward the hallway bathroom. Theodore watched them go, hating himself for the resignation in their small voices, for the way they'd learned not to hope for too much from him. But he couldn't seem to stop the words that kept spilling out, couldn't seem to control the panic that was rising in his chest like floodwater. Miss Williams, he said, not looking at Keisha as she quietly began cleaning up the baking supplies. I appreciate your initiative this week, but I think there's been some confusion about your role here. No confusion, Mr. Whitmore. Her voice was steady, but he could hear something underneath it. Disappointment, maybe. Or anger. I clean your house. That's what you pay me for. Exactly. Theodore pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts he hadn't touched in months. I'll arrange for proper childcare going forward. This situation shouldn't have happened in the first place. Keisha paused in her cleaning, a dish towel clutched in her hands. And what situation is that, exactly? Theodore looked up sharply, surprised by the challenge in her tone. She was watching him with those warm brown eyes, but there was steel in them now, a quiet strength that made him suddenly aware of how he must look to her. A man running away from his own children's happiness because he was too afraid to deal with the implications. My children becoming attached to someone who's only temporary, he said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. Someone whose job it is to clean, not to care about them. Keisha finished, setting down the towel and crossing her arms over her chest. Not to notice when they're lonely and scared and raising themselves because their father is too busy building his empire to see that his kingdom is falling apart. Theodore felt heat flash through him, anger and shame, and something else he didn't want to name. You don't know anything about my family. I know your daughter braids her own hair every morning because no one else does it for her. Keisha shot back, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced toward the hallway where the children had disappeared. When she spoke again, her tone was quieter but no less intense. I know your son has nightmares 3 times a week and comes downstairs at 6 a.m. to sit by the window watching for you to come home. I know Emma hides vegetables in her napkin at dinner because there's no one there to make sure she eats them. And I know Ethan still sleeps with a picture of his mother under his pillow because he's afraid he'll forget what she looked like. Each word hit Theodore like a physical blow. How did she know these things? How had she learned more about his children in 8 weeks than he seemed to know after 7 years of being their father? That's not. He started, then stopped. Because it was true. All of it. He'd been so focused on maintaining their lifestyle, on keeping the company running, on avoiding the places in his house and his heart that still ached with Catherine's absence, that he'd missed everything that mattered. I'm not trying to replace anyone, Keisha said, her voice gentler now. But those babies need someone to see them, Mr. Whitmore. They need someone to care whether they're happy or sad or scared or excited about small things like cookies and songs and bedtime stories. They have me, Theodore said weakly, even as he realized how hollow the words sounded. Keisha looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Not pity, exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if she understood something about loss and love and the terrible ways people could fail the ones they cared about most. Do they? She asked quietly. Before Theodore could answer, his phone buzzed. A text from his assistant about the Malaysian contracts, about conference calls and profit margins, and all the urgent, important business that had kept him away from this kitchen, this house, this life for so long. He looked at the message, then at Keisha, then toward the hallway where he could hear the sound of his children washing their hands, preparing to return to a father who was already planning his next escape. I have work to do, he said, pocketing the phone and moving toward his home office. Please finish your cleaning and let yourself out. He made it 3 steps before Keisha's voice stopped him cold. When was the last time you hugged them? Theodore froze, his hand on the doorframe. When was the last time you sat down and asked about their day, not because you had to but because you wanted to know? When was the last time you tucked them in at night or read them a story or told them you loved them just because, not because you were leaving for another business trip? Theodore's jaw clenched. That's enough. When was the last time you let them see you cry? Keisha pressed on, and now her voice was thick with emotion. Because they remember their mama crying sometimes, and they remember you crying at the funeral, but since then, nothing. It's like you disappeared along with her, and they're living with a stranger who looks like their father but doesn't seem to feel anything anymore. Theodore spun around, fury blazing in his chest. You have no right. You're right, Keisha said, and suddenly all the fight went out of her voice. I don't have any right. I'm just the help. I clean toilets and dust furniture and collect my paycheck and go home to my own problems. But for 2 months, I've watched your babies try to make themselves small enough not to bother you, good enough to earn your attention, perfect enough to make you love them again. And it's breaking my heart. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of the dishwasher running and the distant noise of the children in the bathroom, their voices muffled and careful, as if they too were afraid of taking up too much space in their own home. Theodore stared at this woman who had somehow managed to see straight through to the core of everything he'd been trying to avoid. Part of him wanted to fire her on the spot, to remove this mirror that was reflecting back all his failures as a father. Part of him wanted to demand she leave and never come back, take her accusations and her insights and her perfect cookies and get out of his life before she made him feel any more than he was already feeling. But a bigger part of him, a part that had been dormant for 2 years, wanted to ask her how she'd learned to see his children so clearly. Wanted to know how she'd found the recipe Catherine had died trying to perfect. Wanted to understand how a stranger had managed to fill his house with more warmth and laughter in one afternoon than he'd managed in 24 months. Instead, he said the only thing his pride would allow. Your services won't be needed next week. I'll have my assistant arrange payment through the agency. He saw Keisha flinch as if he'd slapped her, saw her eyes fill with tears she was too proud to let fall. But she just nodded and turned back to her cleaning, her movements sharp and efficient now, all the earlier warmth gone from her posture. Understood, Mr. Whitmore. I'll be out of your way in 20 minutes. Theodore walked to his office and closed the door, leaning against it as if it could somehow protect him from the chaos this woman had brought into his carefully ordered world. Through the thin walls, he could hear Emma and Ethan returning to the kitchen, could hear their voices rise in disappointment when Keisha undoubtedly told them she wouldn't be coming back. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through nanny agencies, babysitter services, anyone who could provide professional, appropriate, temporary care for his children. Someone who wouldn't bake cookies or sing songs or ask uncomfortable questions about hugs and bedtime stories. Someone who wouldn't make him feel like he was failing at the most important job he'd ever had. But even as he dialed the first number, Theodore couldn't shake the image of his children's faces when they'd seen those cookies, couldn't forget the sound of their laughter echoing through a kitchen that had been silent too long. And he couldn't stop thinking about Keisha Williams, who'd somehow managed to love his children better in 8 weeks than he had in 2 years, and who was about to walk out of their lives because he was too much of a coward to let her stay. The nanny agencies were all booked solid until the following Monday. Theodore had called 7 different services, his frustration mounting with each apologetic voice explaining that qualified childcare professionals didn't typically become available with 12 hours notice, especially not on a Friday afternoon. Daddy, Emma's voice came through his office door, small and hesitant. Can we come in? Theodore rubbed his temples, where a headache was beginning to build. Just a minute, sweetheart. He ended his 8th unsuccessful call and opened the door to find both children standing in the hallway, their faces carefully blank in that way that meant they were trying very hard not to upset him further. Miss Keisha is leaving, Ethan announced, his voice matter-of-fact, but his eyes bright with unshed tears. I know, buddy. I'm arranging for someone else to watch you next week. We don't want someone else, Emma said quietly. We want Miss Keisha. Theodore knelt down to their level, searching for words that would make sense to 7-year-olds without admitting that he was terrified of how easily this stranger had slipped into their lives, how natural she looked in their kitchen, how much he'd wanted to keep eating those perfect cookies while listening to her sing. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions, he began. Because you don't trust her, Emma interrupted, and Theodore was startled by the directness in her voice. Because she's different from us. Emma, that's not. She told us. Ethan said, his small chin jutting out defiantly. She said sometimes people get scared when someone new comes into their family, even if that person is good and kind and makes everyone happy. She said it's not our fault. Theodore felt something twist in his chest. What exactly did she tell you? That some people think the color of your skin matters more than the color of your heart. Emma recited carefully, as if she'd been practicing the words. But that we should judge people by how they treat us, not by how they look. Theodore closed his eyes. Of course, Keisha had found a way to explain his rejection that protected his children from thinking they'd done something wrong, even while it exposed him as exactly the kind of man he'd never thought himself to be. Except that wasn't entirely fair, was it? His objection wasn't about race. It was about boundaries, about professional relationships, about the terrifying way his carefully controlled world had suddenly felt warm and alive again. It was about the fact that when he'd watched Keisha laugh with his children, he'd felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought died with Catherine. But try explaining that to 2 7-year-olds. Miss Keisha isn't leaving because of how she looks, Theodore said carefully. She's leaving because... A crash of thunder interrupted him, so loud it seemed to shake the building. Through the office windows, Theodore could see dark clouds rolling across the Manhattan sky, heavy with the promise of the storm the weather service had been predicting all week. "Daddy, look." Emma pressed her face to the window. "It's getting really dark outside." Theodore's phone buzzed with a weather alert. Severe thunderstorm warning. Flash flood watch. Recommended to shelter in place until further notice. Perfect. As if this day couldn't get any more complicated. "Mr. Whitmore?" Keisha appeared in the doorway, her purse slung over her shoulder, clearly ready to leave. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think I should head out before this storm gets worse. The subway tends to flood when..." Another crack of thunder, this one accompanied by a flash of lightning that lit up the entire apartment. The lights flickered, and a moment later, the power went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing them all in an eerie amber glow. Theodore's phone immediately started buzzing with notifications about power outages throughout the city, subway delays, and increasingly urgent warnings about dangerous travel conditions. "Well," Keisha said, setting down her purse with a resigned sigh. "I guess I'm not going anywhere for a while." Ethan clapped his hands together. "Miss Keisha has to stay. It's just until the storm passes," Theodore said quickly, though he found himself oddly relieved by this turn of events. "The building has backup generators, so we'll be fine here. Should we light some candles?" Emma asked excitedly. "Mama used to light candles when the power went out, and we'd tell ghost stories." Theodore's chest tightened at the memory. Catherine sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, her face illuminated by flickering candlelight, spinning elaborate tales about friendly ghosts and brave children. The twins had been barely 5 then, still young enough to believe in magic, still innocent enough to think their parents would always be there to chase away the darkness. "I think we can manage with the emergency lights," he said stiffly. But Keisha was already moving toward the kitchen. "Actually, candles sound lovely. And if the power's going to be out for a while, we should probably eat those cookies before they get stale." She said it casually, as if she hadn't just been fired, as if this was all perfectly normal. Theodore watched her move through his kitchen with the same easy familiarity she'd shown earlier, opening drawers and cabinets like she'd been doing it for years instead of weeks. "There are candles in the dining room hutch," Emma offered helpfully. "And matches in the junk drawer," Ethan added. Theodore found himself following them to the living room, drawn by something he couldn't name. Keisha had found Catherine's good candles, the ones they'd only used for special occasions, and was arranging them on the coffee table with the same care she'd shown with the baking ingredients. "These are beautiful," she said, running her finger along the brass candlestick holders. "They look like antiques." They were Catherine's grandmother's, Theodore found himself saying. "Wedding gifts from 1952. Keisha's hands stilled on the candles. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have presumed." "It's fine." And surprisingly, it was. For the first time in 2 years, seeing Catherine's things being used, being appreciated, didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like honor, like keeping her memory alive instead of buried. Keisha lit the candles one by one, and slowly the room filled with warm, flickering light that transformed Theodore's sleek, modern space into something intimate and welcoming. The twins settled on the floor near the coffee table, and after a moment's hesitation, Keisha joined them. Theodore remained standing, uncertain of his place in this impromptu gathering, until Emma patted the floor beside her. "Sit with us, Daddy. Like we used to. Like they used to. Before grief had built walls between them. Before work had become his escape. Before he'd forgotten that his children needed more than financial security and professional caregivers." Theodore sat down on the hardwood floor of his own living room, his expensive suit wrinkling, his carefully maintained distance crumbling with each flicker of candlelight. "So," Keisha said, settling back against the couch with a slight smile. "Anyone know any good ghost stories?" "Mama used to tell us about the ghost of the library," Emma said eagerly. "He was a good ghost who helped people find the books they needed most." "And the midnight baker," Ethan added. "She made magic cookies that could cure sadness." Theodore watched Keisha's face as his children shared these precious memories, watched her listen with the same focused attention she'd given them in the kitchen. She didn't try to compete with Catherine's stories or insert herself into memories that belonged to someone else. She just created space for the past to exist alongside the present, for love to continue even after loss. Your mama sounds like she was a wonderful storyteller, Keisha said softly. She was wonderful at everything, Emma said with 7-year-old certainty. Except making grandma's cookies. She tried really, really hard, but they never tasted right. Sometimes the most important things take time to get right, Keisha replied, her eyes meeting Theodore's across the candlelit space. Sometimes we have to try a lot of different ways before we find the one that works. Theodore understood she wasn't just talking about baking, and something in his chest loosened just slightly. Outside, the storm raged against the windows, trapping them all in this moment of unexpected intimacy, this forced proximity that was already changing something fundamental between them. He was starting to suspect that by the time the power came back on, none of them would be quite the same. The storm had settled into a steady rhythm against the windows, and the candles had burned lower, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Emma had curled up against Keisha's side, her head resting on the woman's shoulder, while Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, absently playing with a loose thread on the carpet. "Tell us about when you were little," Emma said sleepily, her voice muffled against Keisha's cardigan. Theodore watched as something shifted in Keisha's expression, a shadow passing across her face like a cloud over the sun. Her hand stilled in Emma's hair, and for a moment, she seemed very far away. "What would you like to know, baby girl? Did you have a mama who made cookies?" Ethan asked, looking up with curious eyes. Keisha was quiet for so long that Theodore thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, touched with something that sounded like old grief. "I did have a mama," she said carefully, "and she tried to make cookies once, for my birthday when I turned 8. But we didn't have all the right ingredients, so she used what we had. Saltine crackers and peanut butter, and a little bit of honey she'd been saving for when I got sick." Emma lifted her head to look at Keisha. "Did they taste good?" "They tasted like love," Keisha said, and Theodore heard a thickness in her voice that made his chest tighten. "They tasted like a mama doing everything she could with what little she had." "Where is she now?" Emma asked with the innocent directness of childhood. Theodore saw Keisha's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "She's in heaven, sweetheart. Like your mama." The words hung in the candlelit air, and Theodore found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by something in Keisha's tone that spoke of pain he recognized. The particular ache of loss that never fully healed, just learned to live alongside hope. "How old were you?" he asked quietly, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Keisha's eyes met his across the flickering light. 12. It was just me and her, and when she got sick, she shrugged, a gesture that tried to minimize something that had clearly shaped her entire life. Foster care after that. Moved around a lot. Theodore felt something cold settle in his stomach. 12 years old and alone. He thought about Emma and Ethan, tried to imagine them navigating the world without parents, without the safety net of love and resources that he'd always taken for granted. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. Keisha nodded, her attention returning to Emma, who had settled back against her shoulder. "It was a long time ago, but I learned things from it. About how precious families are. About not taking the good moments for granted. Is that why you're so good with kids?" Theodore asked. "Maybe," Keisha said, then paused, seeming to weigh her words. "Or maybe it's because I remember what it felt like to be invisible. To be in rooms full of adults who looked through me like I wasn't there, who made decisions about my life without asking what I needed or wanted or feared." The words hit Theodore like a physical blow. How many times had he walked through his own house without really seeing his children? How many decisions had he made about their care, their schedules, their lives, without asking what they actually needed from him? "The first family I lived with," Keisha continued, her voice taking on a distant quality. "They had 3 kids of their own. Beautiful house, nice cars, plenty of money. But their youngest, Marcus, he was about Ethan's age, and he was so hungry for attention that he'd act out just to get someone to notice him. And I watched those parents get so frustrated, so focused on correcting his behavior, that they missed what he was really asking for." Theodore's mouth went dry. What was he asking for? "Same thing all kids ask for," Keisha said, looking directly at him. "To be seen. To matter. To know that the people who are supposed to love them actually like being around them." Emma had fallen asleep against Keisha's shoulder, her breathing soft and even. Ethan was drowsing too, his head nodding as he fought to stay awake. But Theodore was wide alert, every word Keisha spoke landing in his chest like stones in still water, creating ripples that spread outward, disturbing assumptions he'd held for too long. "What happened to Marcus?" he asked. Keisha's face darkened. "Nothing good. By the time I aged out of the system, he was already getting into trouble. Stealing, lying, running away. Last I heard, he was in juvenile detention." She paused, her hand gentle on Emma's back. But it didn't have to be that way. If someone had just stopped, listened, paid attention to what he was really trying to say. Theodore felt something crack open in his chest, a fissure that had been forming all day finally breaking wide. "You think I'm making the same mistake?" It wasn't a question. "I think you're scared," Keisha said simply. "I think you love these babies so much that losing them would destroy you. So you've pulled back just enough to survive." But they don't understand that. All they know is that their daddy used to read them stories, and now he doesn't. Used to tuck them in, and now he doesn't. Used to laugh at their jokes, and now he barely smiles. Theodore's hands clenched into fists on his knees. "I'm trying to provide for them. To give them stability." "They have stability," Keisha interrupted gently. "They have more money than they'll ever need. More opportunities than most kids could dream of. What they don't have is a father who lights up when he sees them. What they don't have is someone who thinks their happiness is worth more than any business deal or board meeting or profit margin." "I do think that," Theodore said, his voice rough with emotion he'd been holding back for months. "Of course I think that." "Then show them," Keisha said. "Because right now, all they know is that they've learned to be small and quiet and good so they don't bother you. They've learned to take care of each other so you don't have to worry about them. They've learned to smile and say yes, Daddy, and not ask for too much because they're afraid that if they're any trouble at all, you might disappear completely." Theodore felt tears burning behind his eyes, the first real tears he'd allowed himself since Catherine's funeral. "I don't know how to be their father without her. Catherine was the heart of everything. She knew how to make them laugh, how to comfort them when they cried, how to make our house feel like home. I'm just the guy who paid the bills." "No, you're not," Keisha said firmly. "You're the guy who built them a tree house in the backyard because Emma wanted a place to read. You're the guy who taught Ethan how to ride his bike by running alongside him for 3 hours until he got it right. You're the guy who used to make up bedtime stories about brave knights and clever princesses who looked exactly like your children." Theodore stared at her. "How do you know that?" "Because they told me," Keisha said softly. "They remember everything, Theodore. Every story, every piggyback ride. Every time you kiss their scraped knees better. They're not asking you to be their mother. They're asking you to be their father again." The sound of his name on her lips, spoken with such gentle certainty, nearly undid him completely. When was the last time someone had called him Theodore instead of Mr. Whitmore? When was the last time someone had seen past the suits and the boardrooms and the carefully maintained control to the man underneath? "I'm afraid I'll do it wrong," he admitted, the words barely a whisper. "I'm afraid I'll let them down the way I let Catherine down." Keisha's eyes sharpened. "How did you let Catherine down?" Theodore looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I should have noticed she was getting sick sooner. Should have insisted on more tests, better doctors. Should have spent less time at work and more time at home. Should have." "Stop." Keisha's voice was firm, but not unkind. "You loved her. She knew that. And she wouldn't want you to carry that guilt. Especially not if it's keeping you from loving your children the way they need to be loved." Thunder crashed overhead, and the candles flickered wildly for a moment before steadying. In the uncertain light, Theodore saw something in Keisha's face that took his breath away. Understanding. Acceptance. The kind of grace he'd forgotten existed in the world. "How do you know so much about love and loss?" he asked. Keisha smiled sadly. "Because I've had plenty of both. Because I've learned that the only thing worse than losing someone you love is never letting yourself love them fully while you have the chance." Theodore felt something shift inside him, some wall he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. This woman, this stranger who'd walked into his life 12 hours ago, somehow understood things about grief and healing that he'd been too afraid to face. And for the first time since Catherine died, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face them alone. Have you ever met someone who saw straight through to your heart and helped you understand things about yourself that you'd been afraid to see? What did that feel like? Share your story below. Theodore found himself studying Keisha's face in the candlelight, memorizing the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled, the gentle curve of her mouth as she hummed softly to keep Emma sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. There was something almost ethereal about her in this moment, holding his daughter with such natural tenderness while Ethan had somehow migrated closer, now curled up against her other side. "You're good at this," Theodore said quietly, gesturing toward his sleeping children. "I've had practice," Keisha replied, but there was something in her tone that made him curious. "Other families?" She shook her head slightly. "My little sister, before Mama got sick. I was only 4 years older, but when Mama started working double shifts to pay for her medicine, I became the one who made sure Zaria did her homework, brushed her teeth, got to school on time." Theodore felt his chest tighten. What happened to her? "Different foster home," Keisha said simply, but he could hear years of pain compressed into those 3 words. "They said it would be better if we were separated, that we'd have a better chance of finding permanent families if we weren't a package deal." How old was she? 8. Same age as Emma. Keisha's hand unconsciously smoothed Emma's hair. "I haven't seen her since I was 16. The system, it doesn't make it easy to stay connected." Theodore tried to imagine Emma and Ethan being torn apart, never seeing each other again, and felt physically sick. "I'm sorry. That's unforgivable. It's life," Keisha said with a shrug that didn't quite hide the hurt underneath. "But it taught me something important. Every day you get with the people you love is a gift. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee you get to kiss better, every silly joke that makes them laugh, it's all borrowed time, and you don't know how much you'll get." She looked down at Emma, still sleeping peacefully, then over at Ethan, who was fighting to keep his eyes open. "These babies of yours, they're not going to be little forever." Emma's already losing teeth and asking questions about why some kids have different color skin than others. Ethan's starting to notice when other kids talk about their daddies teaching them to play catch or helping with homework. Pretty soon, they're going to stop asking for your attention because they'll learn to live without it. And then one day, you'll look up from your phone or your laptop or whatever important thing is demanding your focus, and they'll be grown up and gone, and you'll realize you missed it all. Theodore felt something twist in his gut. "You think I don't know that? I think you're terrified of it," Keisha said gently. "I think you love them so much that the thought of losing them the way you lost Catherine makes you want to build walls high enough that it won't hurt as much when it happens. But here's the thing about walls, Theodore. They don't just keep out the pain. They keep out the joy too." Thunder rumbled overhead, but softer now, the storm beginning to move away from the city. Theodore found himself wishing it would last longer, wishing this forced intimacy didn't have to end. When was the last time he'd had a real conversation with another adult? When was the last time someone had challenged him to be better instead of just telling him what he wanted to hear? "Tell me about Catherine," Keisha said suddenly. "Not the sick version. The before version. What made you fall in love with her?" Theodore's first instinct was to deflect, to change the subject, to retreat behind the safe walls of professional politeness. But something about the way Keisha was looking at him, something about the gentle weight of his children sleeping trustingly against this woman who'd shown them more genuine care in 2 months than he'd managed in 2 years, made him want to answer honestly. "She laughed at terrible movies," he said, surprising himself. "She would pick the absolute worst romantic comedies on Netflix, the ones with completely ridiculous plots and over-the-top acting, and she would laugh until she cried. And then she'd make me watch them with her, and somehow, seeing her enjoy them so much made me enjoy them too." Keisha smiled. "What else?" "She talked to plants," Theodore continued, the memories coming easier now. "She had this huge garden on the terrace, and she would spend hours out there, having full conversations with her tomatoes and roses like they were old friends. She swore it made them grow better, and honestly, I never saw plants thrive the way hers did." "She sounds wonderful." "She was." Theodore felt tears prick his eyes, but for the first time, they weren't tears of pure grief. They were tears of gratitude, of love that continued even after loss. She made everything better just by being there. "The kids were easier when she was around. I was happier. The whole house just sang when Catherine was in it. And when she got sick?" Theodore's face darkened. She tried so hard to keep being that person. Even when the treatments made her exhausted, even when she could barely keep food down, she still tried to read bedtime stories and help with homework and maintain all the routines that made the kids feel safe. "But I could see her fading, and I didn't know how to help." "So you worked more." "I worked more," Theodore admitted. I told myself it was practical. Medical bills, securing their future, keeping the company strong so they'd never want for anything. But really, I think I was just running away from watching her die. Keisha was quiet for a moment, her fingers still gently stroking Emma's hair. Did she know? How much you loved her? I hope so, Theodore said, his voice rough. I tried to tell her, especially near the end. But words felt so inadequate. How do you sum up 15 years of loving someone? How do you fit a lifetime of gratitude into the few moments when she was awake and alert enough to hear it? You show them, Keisha said softly. Every day in small ways. You show them by paying attention to what makes them happy, by remembering the things that matter to them, by choosing to be present instead of perfect. Theodore looked at his sleeping children, really looked at them, and felt something shift in his chest. Emma's face was relaxed in sleep, but even unconscious, she seemed more peaceful than he'd seen her in months. Ethan's small hand was curled against Keisha's arm, trusting and secure in a way that made Theodore's throat tight with emotion. They trust you, he said. They want to trust you too, Keisha replied. They're just waiting for permission. Permission for what? To need you. To love you without being afraid you'll disappear again. To be kids instead of little adults who've learned to take care of themselves because they can't count on anyone else to do it. Theodore felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. I don't want them to remember me as the father who was never there. Then don't be, Keisha said simply. Start tomorrow. Start right now. Start with small things. Ask Emma about her dreams, the real ones she has when she's sleeping, not just her career ambitions. Ask Ethan what his favorite color is this week, because it changes and he thinks that's fascinating. Learn what makes them laugh, what scares them, what they wonder about when they're lying in bed at night. What if I mess it up? Keisha smiled, and Theodore felt something warm unfurl in his chest at the sight. Then you mess it up and try again. Kids are remarkably forgiving, especially when they can see you're trying. They don't need perfect, Theodore. They need real. They need you to show up, even when it's messy, even when you don't know what you're doing. Outside, the rain had gentled to a soft patter against the windows. The emergency lighting flickered, and somewhere in the building, Theodore could hear the hum of generators working to restore power. Soon, the storm would pass, the lights would come back on, and this strange, intimate interlude would end. But something had changed in this candlelit living room, something that couldn't be undone by the return of electricity or the demands of Monday morning. Theodore had glimpsed something he thought he'd lost forever, the possibility of connection, of healing, of love that could grow even in the spaces left by grief. And he found himself hoping, for the first time in 2 years, that maybe it wasn't too late to become the father his children needed him to be. Maybe it wasn't too late to become the man Catherine had fallen in love with all those years ago. Maybe it wasn't too late to let someone else see him clearly and choose to stay anyway. As if she could read his thoughts, Keisha looked up and met his eyes across the flickering candlelight. It's going to be okay, Theodore. You're going to be okay. And for the first time since Catherine died, he almost believed it might be true. The power came back on at exactly 11:47 p.m., flooding the living room with harsh fluorescent light that made everyone squint and destroyed the intimate cocoon they'd built with candlelight and whispered conversations. Emma stirred against Keisha's shoulder, blinking in confusion, while Ethan sat up abruptly, his hair sticking up at odd angles. Is the storm over? Emma asked sleepily. Theodore's phone immediately exploded with notifications. Emails from Tokyo, messages from his assistant, urgent flags on contracts that needed his immediate attention. The real world came crashing back in like a tidal wave, washing away the fragile peace they'd found in the darkness. Daddy, your phone is buzzing, Ethan pointed out unnecessarily. Theodore looked at the screen, then at Keisha, who was carefully extracting herself from beneath his sleeping children. The spell was broken. The forced intimacy that had allowed them to speak truths in the candlelight suddenly felt too raw, too exposed under the bright overhead lights. I should get them to bed, Theodore said, standing and brushing imaginary dust from his wrinkled suit pants. Of course, Keisha replied, her voice carefully neutral. She began gathering the used candles, returning them to their proper places with the same efficiency she'd shown in the kitchen earlier. And I should head home. The subways are probably running again. It's almost midnight, Theodore found himself saying. Are you sure it's safe? Keisha paused in her tidying, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Mr. Whitmore. I think I can manage a subway ride. Mr. Whitmore. Not Theodore. Something cold settled in his stomach at the return to formal distance, but he couldn't bring himself to object. What had he expected? That one evening of forced proximity would change everything? That sharing painful memories by candlelight would somehow bridge the gap between their worlds? His phone buzzed again. Emergency board meeting scheduled for 8 a.m. The Nakamura contracts needed revision before the Tokyo markets opened. 3 different crises requiring his immediate attention, each one more urgent than his children's bedtime routine. Daddy, Emma was tugging on his sleeve. Will you tuck us in tonight? Theodore looked down at his daughter, at the hope shining in her eyes, and felt something tear in his chest. I have some important calls to make, sweetheart. Maybe tomorrow night. He watched the light die in Emma's face, watched her small shoulders set in resignation, and hated himself for putting it there. But the contracts couldn't wait, the board meeting couldn't be postponed, and the delicate international negotiations he'd been building for months couldn't be derailed because he'd spent one evening playing house with the help. The help. The thought felt ugly even as it crossed his mind, but it was true, wasn't it? Keisha Williams was an employee, nothing more. She cleaned his house, cashed her paycheck, and went home to her own life. Tonight had been an anomaly, a storm-induced aberration that had allowed them all to pretend they were something they weren't. I'll tuck you in, babies, Keisha said softly, and Theodore saw Emma's face brighten slightly. Just like we've been doing all week. No. The word came out sharper than Theodore intended, and he saw everyone flinch. No, that won't be necessary. Emma, Ethan, go brush your teeth and get into your pajamas. I'll be up in a few minutes. But Miss Keisha always reads us a story, Ethan protested. Miss Keisha is going home, Theodore said firmly, ignoring the way Keisha's hands stilled on the candles she'd been arranging. And starting Monday, you'll have a proper nanny who understands appropriate boundaries. The words hung in the air like a slap. Theodore watched Keisha's face close off, watched her retreat behind the same professional mask she'd worn when he'd first surprised her in his kitchen hours ago. But this time, there was something else there too. Hurt, disappointment, and underneath it all, a kind of weary recognition, as if she'd been expecting this rejection all along. Of course, Keisha said quietly. I apologize if I overstepped. You didn't, Theodore started, then stopped. What was he going to say? That she hadn't overstepped? She had. That he hadn't minded? He had. That he wasn't scared of how easily she'd slipped into their lives, how naturally his children had taken to her, how much he'd enjoyed talking to another adult who saw him as something other than a bank account with a heartbeat. He was terrified of all of it. Emma, Ethan, upstairs. Now. His voice had taken on the authoritative tone that ended boardroom arguments and made grown men scramble to execute his wishes. His children looked between him and Keisha uncertainly, sensing the tension they didn't understand. Will we see you again, Miss Keisha? Emma asked in a small voice. Keisha knelt down to Emma's level, her face gentle despite the hurt Theodore could see in her eyes. Maybe someday, baby girl. But for now, you be good for your daddy, okay? And remember what we talked about. Remember that you're smart and beautiful and worthy of all the love in the world. Emma nodded solemnly and wrapped her small arms around Keisha's neck. Theodore watched his daughter cling to this woman who'd shown her more maternal affection in 2 months than she'd received since Catherine died, and felt something vicious twist in his gut. Jealousy. He was jealous of his own children's affection for someone who'd clearly earned it while he'd been too busy, too distant, too wrapped up in his own grief to notice they were drowning. Ethan, hug, Emma whispered, and her brother dutifully wrapped his arms around Keisha too, his small body shaking slightly with suppressed tears. I love you both, Keisha whispered into their hair. Don't ever forget that. We love you too, Emma said, and Theodore watched Keisha's composure finally crack, watched a tear slip down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. Enough, Theodore said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Upstairs. Now. The children reluctantly disentangled themselves and trudged toward the staircase, their earlier joy completely extinguished. Theodore listened to their footsteps on the hardwood stairs, each step feeling like an accusation. When they were gone, Silence stretched between him and Keisha like a chasm neither of them seemed able to cross. She finished gathering her things with quick, efficient movements, her face carefully blank. "The children will be fine," she said without looking at him. "They're resilient. They'll adjust to whoever you hire." "I know they will," Theodore replied, but the words felt hollow. Keisha shouldered her purse and walked toward the front door, her heels clicking against the marble with a finality that made Theodore's chest tight. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, her back to him. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "tonight was the happiest I've seen them since I started working here. They lit up when you sat on the floor with them, when you shared memories of their mother, when you actually listened to what they were saying instead of just waiting for them to stop talking so you could get back to work." Theodore felt each word like a physical blow, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. "They love you so much, Theodore," Keisha continued, her voice thick with emotion. "They just want to matter to you more than your phone does, more than your meetings do, more than whatever it is that keeps you running away from the best parts of your own life." She opened the door, then paused again. "I hope you find your way back to them before it's too late. Because some chances don't come around twice, and some hearts don't heal from being broken too many times." The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Theodore stood alone in his pristine living room, surrounded by the remnants of the evening that had changed everything and nothing at all. The candles were back in their proper places, the emergency lighting had been turned off, and his phone was still buzzing insistently with urgent matters that suddenly felt utterly meaningless. Upstairs, he could hear his children getting ready for bed alone, their voices subdued, their earlier happiness completely evaporated. He should go to them, should tuck them in, should try to repair the damage his rejection had caused. Instead, he walked to his office, closed the door, and picked up his phone to deal with the contracts that would still matter tomorrow. Unlike the trust he'd just shattered in his children's eyes, unlike the connection he'd just severed with the woman who'd somehow managed to bring light back into their darkness. By the time he finally made it upstairs, Emma and Ethan were already asleep, curled together in Emma's bed like they used to do when they were smaller and afraid of thunderstorms. They'd tucked themselves in, brushed their own teeth, and found their own comfort in each other because they'd learned not to depend on him for the things that mattered. Theodore stood in the doorway watching his children sleep, and for the first time in 2 years, he wondered if Catherine would even recognize the man he'd become. The man who had just pushed away the best thing that had happened to their family since she died. The man who was apparently determined to lose everyone he loved, one devastating choice at a time. Theodore didn't sleep. He spent the night in his office, staring at contracts that blurred together into meaningless legal jargon, his mind replaying every moment from the kitchen to the candlelit confessions to the look in Keisha's eyes when he dismissed her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. At 3 a.m., he found himself standing in Emma's doorway again, watching his children sleep. They'd separated sometime during the night. Emma sprawled across her bed with her arms flung wide. Ethan curled into a tight ball, clutching the stuffed elephant Catherine had given him for his 5th birthday. Even in sleep, they looked smaller than they should, more fragile, like they'd learned to take up as little space as possible. When had that happened? When had his children started apologizing for existing? Theodore's phone buzzed with another urgent email, and he almost threw it across the room. Instead, he turned it off completely and walked downstairs to the kitchen, where the lingering scent of cinnamon and vanilla still hung in the air like a ghost of happiness. The cookies were still there, covered with plastic wrap, sitting on the counter like an accusation. Theodore took one and bit into it, and immediately understood why Catherine had tried so hard to recreate this exact taste. It wasn't just the perfect balance of sweetness and spice. It wasn't just the tender crumb or the way they melted slightly on his tongue. It was love made edible. It was the taste of someone caring enough to pay attention, to try again and again until they got it right, to create something beautiful simply because it would bring joy to people they cared about. When was the last time he'd created anything beautiful for his children? When was the last time he'd paid attention to what would bring them joy instead of what would keep them quiet and out of his way? Theodore ate 3 cookies standing alone in his dark kitchen, and with each bite, he felt something inside him crumble and rebuild itself into a different shape. A shape that might be brave enough to admit when he was wrong. A shape that might be strong enough to change. By sunrise, He'd made a decision that terrified him more than any hostile takeover or failed merger ever had. At 7 a.m., he called his assistant. "Cancel the board meeting," he said without preamble. "Sir? The Tokyo contracts. We'll have to wait. Cancel all my meetings today. And Sandra? I need you to find someone for me. Keisha Williams. She works for Spotless Solutions Cleaning Service. I need her address." There was a pause. "Sir, is this about the children? Because I can have 3 qualified nannies here by noon." "It's not about the children," Theodore said, then stopped. "Actually, it is about the children. But not in the way you think. Just find her, Sandra. Please." He hung up and went upstairs, where Emma and Ethan were just beginning to stir. For the first time in months, Theodore didn't rush them through breakfast or hand them off to whoever was supposed to watch them that day. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table and asked Emma about the book she'd been reading, listened to Ethan's elaborate description of the dream he'd had about flying dinosaurs. "Are you sick, Daddy?" Emma asked, studying his face with concern. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you're not looking at your phone," Ethan observed matter-of-factly. "And you're asking us questions like you actually want to know the answers." Theodore felt something crack in his chest. "I do want to know the answers. I should have been asking all along." The children exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them that excluded him entirely. How many conversations had they had about their absent father? How many times had they comforted each other when he was too busy to comfort them? "Will Miss Keisha come back today?" Emma asked hopefully. "I don't know," Theodore said honestly. "But I'm going to try to find out." Sandra called back at 9:30 with an address in Queens. Theodore arranged for Mrs. Peterson from next door to watch the children for a few hours, ignoring Emma and Ethan's protest that they didn't need a babysitter. They'd been taking care of themselves just fine. The fact that they meant it made his chest ache. The subway ride to Queens gave Theodore too much time to think about what he was going to say when he found Keisha. "How did you apologize for rejecting someone's kindness? How did you explain that you'd pushed them away not because they'd done something wrong, but because they'd done everything right, and that terrified you more than failure ever could?" Keisha's building was a modest brick walk-up in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. Theodore climbed 3 flights of narrow stairs, his expensive shoes echoing in the hallway, feeling more out of place than he ever had in any boardroom or country club. He knocked on apartment 3B and waited. The door opened, and Keisha appeared wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger without her work clothes, more vulnerable, and Theodore felt something twist in his gut when he saw the surprise and wariness that flashed across her face. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "is everything all right? Are the children?" "The children are fine," Theodore said quickly. I need to talk to you. May I come in?" Keisha hesitated, and Theodore could practically see her weighing the wisdom of letting her former employer into her personal space. Finally, she stepped aside and gestured him into a small but immaculately clean living room furnished with pieces that had clearly been chosen for function rather than fashion. "Coffee?" she offered, falling back on hospitality when the silence stretched too long. "No, thank you." Theodore remained standing, suddenly unsure of his place in this space that was so fundamentally different from his sterile penthouse. "I came to apologize." Keisha raised an eyebrow. "For firing me? That's your right as an employer, Mr. Whitmore. I understand. Not for firing you," Theodore interrupted. "For being afraid of you." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Keisha's face softened slightly, but she didn't move closer, didn't make this easier for him. "Afraid of me," she repeated. Theodore ran a hand through his hair, destroying the careful styling that had taken him 20 minutes that morning. "You walked into my house, and in 2 months, you made my children happier than I'd managed to make them in 2 years. You found a recipe that my wife died trying to perfect. You filled my home with laughter and warmth and all the things I thought died with Catherine." He paused, struggling to find words for feelings he'd spent months avoiding. "And instead of being grateful, I was terrified. Because if you could do all that in 8 weeks, what did that say about me as a father? What did that say about the 2 years I spent hiding in my office while my children learned to raise themselves?" Keisha was watching him with those warm brown eyes, her expression unreadable. "So I pushed you away," Theodore continued, his voice rough with shame. "I pushed you away because it was easier than admitting I'd been failing them. Easier than facing the fact that I'd been so afraid of losing them that I'd already lost them, piece by piece, choice by choice. Every time I picked up my phone instead of picking up my son. Every time I closed my office door instead of opening my heart. He took a step closer, and she didn't back away. I came here to ask if you'll forgive me, and to ask if you'll come back. Not as their housekeeper. I don't know what as someone who cares about them. As someone who can teach me how to be the father they deserve instead of just the provider I've become. Keisha was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if she were looking for something specific. Finally, she spoke. What makes you think anything would be different this time? Because I turned off my phone, Theodore said simply. Because I canceled my meetings. Because I realized last night that in 6 months or 6 years, when I'm lying on my deathbed thinking about my life, I'm not going to regret missing a board meeting or losing a contract. I'm going to regret missing Emma's first school play and Ethan's soccer games and all the small, irreplaceable moments that make up a childhood. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her eyes. Because I realized I'd rather be a mediocre businessman and a great father than the other way around. And because I think you might be the key to helping me figure out how to do that. Keisha was silent for so long that Theodore began to think she was going to refuse. Then she smiled, just a small curve of her lips, but it was enough to make hope bloom in his chest like a flower after winter. The children are probably wondering where you are, she said. Probably, Theodore agreed. Would you like to come see them? I think they have some things they'd like to say to you. Such as they love you. Such as they missed you last night. Such as they think you make the best cookies in the world, and they want you to teach them how to make them properly, so they can surprise me when I get home from work. Keisha's smile widened. And when will you be getting home from work these days, Mr. Whitmore? Every day by 6, Theodore said, and meant it. Earlier on weekends. And Theodore, please. I think we're past formalities, don't you? Keisha grabbed her coat from a hook by the door. I think we might be, Theodore. I think we definitely might be. As they walked toward the subway together, Theodore felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the anticipation of going home not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because the people he loved most in the world were waiting for him there, and for the first time since Catherine died, he was choosing them over everything else. It was the easiest choice he'd ever made, and the most terrifying. But as Keisha slipped her hand into his somewhere between the subway turnstile and the train platform, Theodore realized that maybe the best things in life were supposed to be a little bit scary. Maybe that's how you knew they were worth fighting for. The elevator doors opened to reveal Emma and Ethan pressed against the living room windows, their small faces fogged with breath as they watched the street below. Mrs. Peterson sat nearby with her knitting, occasionally glancing up at the children with the patient expression of someone who'd raised 4 kids of her own. They've been like that for 20 minutes. She told Theodore as he and Keisha entered. Said they were watching for someone important. Emma spotted them first. Miss Keisha, she shrieked, abandoning the window to launch herself across the room. You came back. Ethan was right behind her, and Theodore watched as both his children wrapped themselves around Keisha like she was a life preserver in stormy waters. Over their heads, Keisha's eyes met his, bright with unshed tears. I told you we were watching for someone important, Emma said, her face pressed against Keisha's sweater. And I told Daddy that I missed you. Ethan added, looking up at Theodore with something that might have been approval. He said he was going to try to fix it. Did he now? Keisha said, her voice warm with affection as she smoothed Ethan's cowlick. We made a list, Emma announced, pulling away to grab a piece of paper from the coffee table. Of all the things we want to do when you come back. Ethan drew pictures. Theodore looked at the paper Emma thrust toward them. In careful 7-year-old handwriting, she'd written, Fun things for Miss Keisha and Daddy. Below it were Ethan's crayon drawings, stick figures baking cookies, reading books, playing in what looked like a park. This one is us having a picnic, Ethan explained, pointing to a drawing of 4 stick figures sitting on a green rectangle. And this one is Daddy pushing us on swings while you watch. And this one. He paused, his small finger hovering over a drawing that made Theodore's breath catch. For figures standing in front of what was clearly their building, but with something extra. Hearts floating above their heads like balloons, and words written in Emma's careful script. Our family. Emma helped me spell it. Ethan said proudly, then looked up at Theodore uncertainly. Is that okay? That we drew you and Miss Keisha with us? Theodore knelt down so he was at eye level with his children, These miraculous small people who'd somehow maintained their capacity for hope despite everything he'd put them through. "It's more than okay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's perfect. Does that mean Miss Keisha can stay?" Emma asked, bouncing on her toes. "Like really stay? Not just for today?" Theodore looked up at Keisha, who was watching this exchange with soft eyes. "That depends on Miss Keisha. We haven't talked about the details yet." "What kind of details?" Keisha asked, settling onto the couch so the children could curl up on either side of her. "Well," Theodore said, taking the armchair across from them. "First, I think we need to establish that you're not the housekeeper anymore. I'd like to offer you a different position." "What position?" Keisha asked cautiously. "Family manager," Theodore said, the title sounding right as soon as he said it. "Someone who helps me remember what matters most. Someone who makes sure I'm home for dinner and bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. Someone who teaches me how to braid Emma's hair and throw a proper baseball to Ethan and make cookies that taste like love. And someone who keeps us company when Daddy has to travel for work," Emma added pragmatically. "About that," Theodore said, "I'm cutting my travel by 70%. No more 3-week trips to Tokyo. No more missing school plays or soccer games, or just regular Tuesday dinners." Both children stared at him as if he'd announced he was joining the circus. "Really?" Ethan whispered. "Really," Theodore confirmed. "I've spent 2 years thinking I was protecting you by providing for you. But what I was really doing was abandoning you. And that stops now." "What about your important business?" Emma asked, because even at 7, she understood that her father's work had always come first. "My business will be just fine," Theodore said. "But even if it wasn't, you're more important. You've always been more important. I just forgot that for a while." Keisha was watching him with something that looked like admiration, and Theodore felt warmth spread through his chest. "So," she said slowly, "this family manager position. What exactly would it entail?" "Helping me learn how to be present instead of just physically here," Theodore said. "Teaching me what makes Emma laugh and what scares Ethan at night, and how to tell when they need extra hugs instead of extra space. And baking," Emma added firmly. "Definitely baking. And maybe teaching us some of those songs you know. And helping Daddy learn how to play games without checking his phone," Ethan said, giving Theodore a pointed look. Theodore laughed, a sound that surprised him with its genuineness. "Yes, definitely that. There's one more thing," he said, looking directly at Keisha. "I'd like this to be a live-in position. There's a guest suite on the 3rd floor that you're welcome to make your own, if you're interested. The children would love having you close by, and honestly, I think I need the accountability. Too easy to slip back into old patterns if you're not here to call me on it." Keisha was quiet for a moment, and Theodore held his breath, waiting for her answer. The children were quiet too, sensing the weight of this moment. "What about your board of directors?" she finally asked. "What about the people who expect you to be available 24/7? "They'll adjust," Theodore said firmly. "And if they don't, I'll find new board members. There are plenty of brilliant business minds in the world. But there's only one Emma and one Ethan, and only one chance to be their father while they still want me to be." Emma reached over and took Keisha's hand. "Please say yes, Miss Keisha. We'll be really good, I promise. And Daddy will try to be good too." "I'll try very hard to be good," Theodore added solemnly, which made both children giggle. Keisha looked around the room, at the children who were watching her with hopeful eyes, at the man who'd somehow found the courage to admit he'd been wrong, at the drawings scattered on the coffee table that depicted a family that could be theirs if she was brave enough to say yes. "There's one condition," she said finally. "Anything," Theodore said immediately. "Family dinner every night at 6:30. No phones, no work calls, no exceptions unless someone is literally dying." "Deal," Theodore said without hesitation. "And Saturday morning pancakes are mandatory." "Absolutely. And we all take turns picking the bedtime story." "Even me?" Theodore asked, and was rewarded with Emma's delighted laugh. "Especially you, Daddy. You used to tell the best stories." Keisha smiled, that radiant expression that had been haunting Theodore's thoughts all morning. "In that case, yes. I'd love to be your family manager." The children erupted in cheers, flinging themselves at Keisha with renewed enthusiasm. Over their heads, she looked at Theodore, and he saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. "Thank you," he mouthed silently. "Thank you," she mouthed back, and Theodore understood she wasn't just talking about the job. 3 months later, Theodore stood in the kitchen doorway watching Keisha teach Emma how to fold cookie dough, while Ethan regaled them both with a story about his day at school. The scene was so domestic, so perfectly normal, that it took his breath away. His phone buzzed with what was probably an urgent email, and Theodore pulled it out of his pocket, ready to silence it without looking. But Emma caught the movement. "Daddy," she said with the patient tone of someone who'd had this conversation before, "what's the rule?" "No phones during family time," Theodore recited dutifully, dropping the device back into his pocket without checking the message. "And what time is it?" Ethan added, grinning at him. "Family time," Theodore said, crossing to the island where his family was gathered. "Always family time when we're all together." He wrapped his arms around all three of them, breathing in the scent of vanilla and cinnamon and the indefinable sweetness of home. In the past 3 months, he'd learned that Emma's favorite bedtime story was still the one about the brave princess who saved the kingdom with kindness instead of swords. He'd learned that Ethan had nightmares about monsters, but they went away if someone sang to him. He'd learned that Keisha hummed when she was content, and that her laugh could light up even his darkest moods. Most importantly, he'd learned that love wasn't something you earned through perfect behavior or endless providing. Love was something you chose every day, in small moments and grand gestures, in the decision to be present instead of perfect, to show up instead of just sending money. "Daddy," Emma said, flower on her cheek and joy in her voice, "will you help us make the cookies for the school bake sale tomorrow?" "Wouldn't miss it," Theodore said, and meant it. Outside, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Inside, his kitchen was warm with laughter and the promise of tomorrow's adventures. And Theodore Whitmore, who'd once measured his worth in profit margins and boardroom victories, realized that the most successful thing he'd ever done was learn how to come home. Not just to a house, but to the people who made it worth living in. To the family he'd almost lost, and the woman who'd helped him find his way back to them. To love, imperfect and messy and absolutely everything he'd never known he needed. The best things in life often come disguised as ordinary moments. What small, everyday occurrence in your own life brings you the most joy? Sometimes the simplest pleasures are the ones worth fighting for. Share your favorite family moment below.
Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this one, then you'll absolutely love the next. It's even crazier and more captivating than you can imagine. So go ahead and click the video showing right here on your screen, and I'll see you in the next story.